One of
Well,
these, we should like have ourselves like in a little screen with the little when the little intro's going because we're both over here going.
you um, yeah, it's too good of a beat. You got to show some dancing with it.
Exactly.
Yeah. So we're talking about the myth of private property today. So there's a lot of bummer in that. Thought we'd
There's a
start
lot
with
of bummer in that.
some of the good news in the world first. I'll
Yeah.
start. I'll start because I got married about
Woo!
a week ago, I suppose.
We yeah, we can have to
Well,
go.
yep, and yeah. So there's my ring. It's hard to see, but the wedding band has all the colors of the gay rainbow on it. And,
Nice.
now I'm Mrs. Pendergast.
Woo! That means I have to go through all of our quotes from you and change the names on them again, don't I?
I mean, that's not as big as when changing the name because of the dead name. I mean, I
Yeah,
don't think of Van Steenwyck as my dead name, so that's good.
that's fair. Uh, yeah, and that was actually the first time the two of us have met in person.
Yeah,
Was at your wedding.
in real life. Yeah, you're
We've been
taller
working
than I am.
together for am I?
I think so. Not by a lot. Or were
I
you
didn't
wearing
really
heels?
no, I wasn't. I
So
was wearing
you're a little
flats.
taller.
Okay.
Not by much. I'm yeah. I'm fairly tall for a woman, but so, but you had some other interesting news that's getting
Yeah,
me there.
so, this is more fun, national news-ish.
Mhm.
So both the state of Utah and Idaho have passed bills that ban the use of pride flags in government buildings and schools. Um, However, the cities of Salt Lake City and Boise have both passed local resolutions to make pride flags official city flags, which no longer makes them um, the I don't know quote political flag that uh, their Republican legislature called the pride flag, which it's
Mhm.
not political, but that's besides the point. Anyways, so Salt Lake City like took the flower that is on their city flag and just put it on top of the the progress flag, the trans flag, and the Juneteenth flag. So they have now a total of 4 official city flags. And the city of Boise just made the pride flag one of they didn't do anything to it. They just made it an official city flag. So yeah, both cities are allowed to fly pride flags because they've said that they are official city flags. So
Yeah, and it's particularly delightful because if you think about where Boise and Salt Lake City are located, like
yeah,
they're surrounded. Those aren't blue states. They're
no,
they're
no, they're
red
not.
states. And I know city folks tend to be a little bit more progressive, but it's pretty sure it irks plenty
Well,
of
so
outlying areas, which is
like I
that's
get
a
that they're
delightful fuck you.
yeah. I get that they are like the progressive or liberal aspect of those very red states, but at the same time, Salt Lake City had a unanimous vote, um, which is crazy to think about. Boise had a 5-1 approval of it, so only one person dissenting. Which I've lived in Boise, like to have like I get it's been 15 years since I've lived in Boise, so things have changed.
Yeah,
Uh, but I still would not have expected a 5-1 vote to approve this. But it's pretty cool for cities to like use their own local power to be like, we are not going to bow to fascists. So it's pretty cool.
and I don't want to get lost in the weeds on this, but it's so fascinating how much like conservatism when I was growing up it was always tied to the abortion stuff and all that. But even more, it was tied to this idea of state rights
Hmm.
and local rights. And to see that flip
Yeah.
because it's really conservatives generally in our society are authoritarians.
Hmm.
It's not exactly. It's weird to see like Minnesota assert state rights, protect democracy within Minnesota.
Yeah.
Yeah, given the history. Speaking of history, there's a long and interesting history tied up with property rights, private property. So let's talk about that. How was that segue? That's perfect.
That was great. That was a great segue.
Speaking of history, it's the only way I could be better at like awkward segues is if I were a youth minister. 'Cause, who else
Uh,
had something to say about history? Jesus of Nazareth. Like there's that kind of. Anyways, so private property is one of these categories in our minds that even if you're like a leftist, it's hard to break out of the sense that it's common sense to have private property, even though it's a
mhm.
relatively novel concept.
Yeah, I think an important thing to start with is to
Defining it.
define the different well, specifically the difference between private property and personal property, because those are two different things.
Yeah, like because if you start talking about private property being a bad idea, people say, "Well, does that mean I can just come into your home, use your toothbrush, and do all these things?"
Yeah.
No. Most people throughout history have recognized that if you have a bow and arrow or a knife or a home, that
Mhm.
those are for your use, and that somebody else shouldn't just come and take it. Like there's been
Yeah.
laws, people have generally frowned upon stealing, but the category of what constitutes theft has changed, right? Now
Mhm.
it's expanded. So private property is this idea that a company, factory, organization, something like that, or land underneath our feet can be owned in hereditary perpetuity, um, and it's yours now forever.
Mhm.
Personal property is this idea of the stuff that you need for your life. You should have some level of autonomy and control over. Um, and so, get the interesting thing is when you start thinking about like, well, what about like? There's a fundamental difference between um, owning a home and not wanting people to come and take your stuff, and Elon Musk making sure that he has complete say over his companies. Those are two completely different ideas that have become conflated in our imaginations because
Yeah.
the myth of private property. Um,
Mhm.
it's just to give a little bit of an interesting thing. People generally point to, um, the history of capitalism is wrapped up with the history of private property.
Mhm.
And people often look to the Enlightenment as when those things were sort of codified. But even like John Locke, great Enlightenment figure that he was, believed that land becomes yours when you mix your labor with it, right? And that's a bad idea because that's the colonial rationale.
Yeah.
When colonizers came to the New World and saw like a bunch of land not being farmed, they felt like it didn't belong to the indigenous people because land ownership is tied to mixing your labor with
Mhm.
it, right? And but the plus side of that is the idea that somebody far away can own uh, 10,000 acres and they pass that on to their son. Meanwhile, everyone else farms their land for them. That is a weird idea that
Yeah.
can
That
only be rooted in some sort of authoritarian logic.
Yeah. It's is what John Locke was talking about, which we do disagree with because it's still a very, like, small mindset of things can't just exist because they should exist, like nature. Um, but it the idea of private property that we have today is so much further than that, especially whenever we tie it up with corporations and stuff like that. Like, you have ownership of the thing that is being used to create wealth, um, not being worked by the person that owns it. This
Mhm.
is something that it isn't even in Locke's kind of view of what he thought was the best was best use. So yeah, it's such an interesting like it's an easy step to take, but it's also some of the original proponents of private property didn't even think of it going that far.
No, this idea of, this world of mega billionaires would have been foreign to the people, but it's
Yeah,
still the same logic. Like, private property is an extension of the divine rights of kings and noble people, right?
yeah,
And so, a lot of people, when they want to point to the history, like what's the origin story of capitalism, they'll talk about trade mercantile systems or fiat currency, like different kinds of things. But one of the narratives in there is the enclosure laws.
yeah.
And the big bad, I think, this was happening for a while before Henry VIII, but he's the one who passed vagabond laws. And
Mhm.
just this really does come into play with how we think about things today. So I'm going to explain it just a little bit. So back in the day, you were a serf and you were therefore tied to the land. But you could also move to the city. But city people tended to be merchants, different sorts of tradespeople. And so but and we generally talk about the time of the serfs in the Middle Ages as a bad thing, and it kind of was. But the plus side was, if you were a serf tied to the land, it wasn't a one-way street. The lord had obligations to the serfs, and the serfs had some level of free access to the commons, right? The enclosure laws said, nope, we're going to get away of that sort of outmoded system. Now that land is the Lord's. Um, and if you are not working in the land, therefore, like, it's worse than a serf because now you're a tenant. It's
Mhm.
different than being a serf. And you're not working in the city in a trade, you're a vagabond. And so you can be arrested and killed. So, like, 60,000 people were murdered for vagabond laws under Henry VIII, right? So it's
Yeah.
a bad thing, but it's the extension of the logic of the divine rights of kings. I can enclose this because it's mine. It's not yours, and now I can pass it on.
Mhm.
And people who like really get excited about free market capitalism, they want to act like it's this pure system. But if you start bringing up these historical things like colonization and genocide and enclosures, they'll say, "Well, that's bad." What I meant to say is we should have free market starting 1, 2, 3 now, and not deal with this history stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just be historical about it. But then it just perpetuates this thing. So, like, this is the question is, why do we think it makes sense to us? Why do we think it makes sense to have something like democracy when it comes to political power, but we don't extend that logic to economic power? Really, all unions are is an attempt to democratize a workforce, so that they have some say over the property too. The whole idea of socialism is seizing the means of production, and agricultural reform, which is kind of the land version of that same thing, is dividing it up to amongst the people. Um,
Yeah.
but all of our laws in the United States tend to skew towards protecting the wealthy.
Yeah.
That's
And
why we still have private property the way it exists in the United States.
yeah. And a myth of capitalism is the idea that you are rewarded for your work and or your work is adequately rewarded. And that's not actually true because if you don't own if you're not the owner of a business, you are getting paid a fraction of what you bring in because whatever you bring in more goes to either the business or to the person who runs it. That's why, owners make more money than the lowest person is because they're taking what the lower people are making, and that's their profit. The idea of socialism is kind of around the idea that your work should have uh, should have an adequate return. So you actually gain from your work, not gain what's left over from your work. Capitalism is explicitly about if you're not the owner, it's explicitly about ensuring that you make more money than what you get back.
Mhm.
That's how that works, which is a broken system, and we act like it's a free and fair system, but it is inherently unfair because if you're not getting back the work that you put in, that's not fairness.
Well,
That's exploitation.
yeah, and so then we just look at if we take a step back with this perspective and analyze our systems, if we call into question how natural it is, like we start noticing things. Um, these wealthy people, and I'm going to keep using Elon Musk because he's a piece of crap. It's fun to make
I mean,
fun of.
yeah,
But it applies to all billionaires. Literally all
it
billionaires fall under this.
literally all of them.
Literally
Elon
all.
Elon is easy because he's public about doing this. Most of them do it behind not on publicly on social media. So Elon Musk is an easy example because people see what he's doing a little bit more than other billionaires.
Yeah, Warren Buffett falls to this critique too, because even if he
Yeah.
lives in a modest home, uh, he owns a bunch of stuff, including land. And what
Mhm.
that does is, so now you have this billionaire who has exclusive use of the land. We try to part of the reason we have governance is because we recognize that people who own a large chunk of land and companies should not be able to do whatever they want because we still have the echoes of common law in our
Yeah.
system. It's not as dominant. That's why you end up with someone who has exclusive use of a bunch of companies and land, not paying much taxes. Now,
Mhm.
in a just society, we maybe wouldn't need taxes because everyone would have access to enough for themselves and their family.
Yeah.
But taxes is the only way we have to kind of slide things into the commons, right? And so
Yeah.
we get this weird thing, and this starts filtering into how we view everything. So, um, how I think of ownership, how we think of autonomy, and then the sense of entitlement someone has to do what they want. Um, and it starts filtering into, uh, enshrining kind of separation and autonomy versus interconnection and obligation. So, and I don't want to get too lost in the weeds on this one, but this rights logic is tied up
Mhm.
in either I have the right to this. If someone comes into my land, I have the right to protect it and kill them if I want.
Yeah.
And I have the right to this, but I don't have any, those people who are landless don't have any rights to the land. The logic of obligation, which is kind of more of that traditional understanding of how people are supposed to be towards each other, is I have, because I have so much, I have an obligation to make sure my fellow um, countrymen or whatever doesn't starve to death. Like there's a
Yeah.
different logic there. And this sort of calloused transactional way that we relate to each other in our society is the byproduct of the logic of extraction and exploitation baked into the concept of private
Yeah.
property. So it's weird to me that people, like spiritually minded people, Christians, let's say in this country, somehow think Christianity enshrines the logic of capitalism and private property and
It
says
really doesn't.
if you take bread because you're starving, you're a thief, and now you're guilty of breaking God's command. That's how people think about it, rather
Yeah.
than thinking about, wait, maybe there was some theft going before this. Maybe Robin Hood wasn't stealing from the rich to give to the poor. Maybe Robin Hood was stealing from the rich who stole from the poor to give it back to the poor.
Yeah.
That extra step gets invisibilized
Well,
of how we got to this situation.
since you did bring up spiritual leaders, let's talk a little bit about what is found in Christianity. If Christianity actually followed what they claim is scripture.
Mhm.
Uh, one of the things that is condemned, especially in the prophets uh, in the Old Testament, is buying up land and exploiting the poor through the wealthy.
Yep.
Um, that's what our system is built off of. Like, also, like the Bible condemns people for charging interest on loans. Like, that's our current banking system is set up on that. So, like, the entire structure of what we call uh our capitalistic economic system is completely based off of anti-Christian like ideals. If we actually cared about like those things that have a tendency to pop up in the Bible, like taking care of the poor and things like that, we would find that our current system doesn't fit that. But like I said, I mean, we don't want
Yeah.
most of the time we don't care what is actually there.
No, and let me just take a giant step into a political pile of poo. Zionism. Okay, so let's just assume, and I don't assume this at all, that Israel has some sort of divine right to that land. Um, Look at the difference between the logic here. Like back when, if we assume that Scripture, when it's talking about the promised land for the promised people, and they're supposed to enter into the land. If we assume that that's all legit and how it happened, the difference between old school logic of hospitality and kinship versus settler colonization is
Hmm.
huge. Back then, the idea was this is a land for you as a people and your clan and your tribe and your family in perpetuity. But it's held in a way that's kind of held in common. And so, if you sell some of your land or even sell your own labor into some sort of debt slavery, there was supposed to be a reset button. That's what the Jubilee was. It it's baked into the whole logic of how you treat the
Hmm.
poor and the stranger, that
Yeah.
sort of thing. Now, like Zionism is this colonial project that encloses the land, mistreats the people that were actually in the land already, and also the foreigner, without hospitality and kinship rules. It becomes
Hmm.
exploitative, extractive. This is ours in a nationalist project. Very different ways of thinking. And it's not
Hmm.
that somehow that older way, that Jubilee way of thinking, was more primitive, and we've progressed to aggressive late stage consumer capitalist colonization. That's also a myth, the myth of progress, that somehow thinks that this is better. Um, and it just ruins, like, human beings did not evolve and develop to live in this sort of arrangement
Yeah.
where somehow you're starving to death, but you're like, well, I don't have a right to that food because it's owned by uh, Cargill or
Yeah.
Monsanto or whatever the company that owns that. That's a weird logic. Um, and it filters everything. We filter everything through it, right? So
Hmm.
um, just the way we think of our kids, almost like property. That's like the traditional assumption, rather than
Yeah. And
believing.
that's the entire push behind the idea of parents' rights right now
Yeah,
is children are property.
wives being property is also kind of tied into
Yeah.
that logic. And and again, this myth of progress. We think that somehow we're more egalitarian now than we've been in the past always, but that's not true.
No,
There have been
it's
more egalitarian societies throughout all of history.
yeah.
Um,
We might be more egalitarian than when we were colonizing the world, but
yeah,
that's congrats, I guess.
even in like churchy spaces, when we want to talk about economic justice, we'll use the language of stewardship,
Hmm.
which is just owner logic applied to we should be good owners, not
Yeah.
stewardship as a form of kinship obligation, which is we have these resources. What are our obligations with this?
Hmm.
I never hear. I've been in so many meetings, church meetings, board meetings, all kinds of different meetings that are ostensibly spiritual meetings. And when you start talking about stewardship, there's this assumption that this is ours to decide what to do with,
Yeah.
rather than we've been entrusted to make these decisions, but we have obligations for them. And this, if you start thinking about all of the biggest problems in our society, almost all of them touch on this private property thing. Police brutality. It's all about that. Because the
Yeah.
cops exist to protect private property and wealth.
Yeah, that's why. police forces were created in the United States was to protect private property, specifically other human beings that were seen as private property, because it was well, our police force was founded on um, trying to wrangle up slaves that
Mhm.
escaped.
And so it kind of raises the question, we could talk more about the myths and how these show up, but, the question of what you do about it becomes really difficult when it's codified into the law.
Hmm.
It's filtered into our understanding of spirituality. Um, it's filtered into our interpersonal relationships. It's even factored into how we relate to our bodies. We treat our bodies like possessions
Hmm.
rather than like us, which is weird. Um, and
Yeah, there.
oh, go
I
ahead.
think that there's sometimes a hyper spiritualization of that, of like because we have a theology that there's a body and a soul or a spirit. Sometimes people say that there's a body, a spirit, and a soul. Um, really, really disconnects the fact that that we are all just kind of a being that is put together in our body. It's all one. Um,
Mhm,
and I've done some theology stuff. I argued this in my conservative seminary of the idea that humanity isn't dualistic, as in material and soul, but it's monolithic or whatever, single. um, and we're not actually supposed to see them as separate, but
mhm,
as one. And I think I won that debate and in the theology class, but it's still something that's so like intertwined in our culture that we even see people who aren't necessarily religious kind of just view their own bodies as kind of something that they own, that they exist in, but not part of who they are. Um, in a larger part, that highlights even the disconnect of our like oneness with the nature around us, because we see ourselves as above, able to own nature, right?
mhm,
We can own property, we can own things that show up around us, and so are disconnected from the world around us. Um, from a theological point of view, like the point of Genesis 1, whenever like that's or Genesis 1 and 2 really,
mhm,
when it highlights uh that like stewardship of the land is kind of part of human um responsibility, that is with the understanding that that humanity is part of the creation. So it
mhm,
like not separate, not over it, but like part of it. And we've so disconnected ourselves from uh from the world, from our connection with nature, that it's almost lost to time where we stand in Western society, because we are just so incredibly disconnected. I'm not saying that people aren't trying to understand and reconnect themselves with the world around them, but it's a lot of work because it's not our natural ideology that's given to us.
yeah. I think a good way of thinking about it, like, the question of what do you do about this? Um, I think before, like, talking about the steps people can take, I think it's better to take a step back and ask a kind of a question first. Like, because right now, if if I had to say what the most sacred thing in our society was, I would say private property is at least in the top three.
Hmm.
Um, it's a sacred thing, meaning it's untouchable, right? It's set apart. Like we can't challenge it. It's so baked in.
Well,
It's so sacred we don't even question. We don't even think about it as sacred.
I think in some ways we think of private property even more sacred than personal property,
Hmm.
and we can kind of see that in the way that like we hardly own anything anymore. So like if you buy a digital video, you don't own it. It still belongs to the corporation that you paid money to. And like it's within the contract of buying digital content that like they can remove it at any time, really without warning, without your consent. Like you don't own it. So we're getting to the point where like person like uh personal property is becoming the private property of somebody else. And
Yeah,
so we're even diminishing personal property
it's
to the
extending
point
to
where we
all
almost
these
don't know.
subscription
Yeah.
services. Like you don't even own like pretty soon you won't own printers and ink. You'll have to, get the printer and then you'll be stuck in a subscription service for ink, right? Like
Yeah.
there's all kinds of things like that. There's an episode of this season of Black Mirror, which I haven't seen yet, but it's based on that kind of concept of, like imagine if all of the things you use for your daily life become mediated through the same logic as our cell phones,
Hmm.
right? Where it's not, we don't really own them,
Yeah.
not really. We pay to have access to the system, and you pay
Hmm.
more to have better access. Um, but and this raises the question to me. Um, I think it's a good discernment question for people to mull over, is to take a step back and ask, what are the most sacred things actually in life, um, and how do we make sure they're not commodities? Because really, when we start talking about how the logic of private property extends
Hmm.
into all facets of life. We talked about it's called commodification,
Yeah.
commoditization, depending on which word you want to use, where things that were not seen as a transactional economic thing now are. Um, and more and more of our lives are commodified,
Hmm.
even our senses of identity, right?
Yeah.
And I think it's important to take a step back and say, well, what things are most sacred? And if those things are actually sacred, they should be decommodified. They should not be sub, subjugated by the logic of capitalistic extraction. So
Yeah.
things like, and the reason I'm framing it that way is like I feel like it's a different conversation to have when we say like we have privatized healthcare and we all should have the right to healthcare, right?
Hmm.
Or healthcare is something we should hold in common, and that's our obligation as a society, and it should never be commoditized to begin with.
Yeah.
Um, because really rights language, and I'm not against rights, obviously. Within our society, that's how we set things apart as kind of sacred in a way, but it's still within the logic of capitalism. I think we should
Hmm.
challenge that. Like, knowledge is commodified, land is commodified. Uh, like I can't think of hardly anything in our society that's not commodified. Relationships are kind
Yeah.
of
Often.
often
Hmm.
commodified. Um, we can talk. We It seems obvious to us that relationships are commodified when we're talking about prostitution, sex work, but then we don't extend that same logic to someone working in a coal mine, like that their bodies are commodified too, right? There's lots of comments on this, and
Yeah.
um, that just Google that shit because it's weird. Like I get that
Hmm.
sex work. Um, there's lots of stigmas about it, and people don't like talking about it, and there's all these concerns about trafficking when we're talking about prostitution, but there's
Which
not a
which are
lot of
two different things, by the way. Like
yes.
trafficking is slavery. Sex work is work. If
Mhm.
it is trafficking, then it's not work, it's slavery. So, uh,
But we only
which
talk
is
about it when it
hard.
comes to sex. We don't talk about it when it comes to where most trafficking happens, which is with labor,
Yeah.
like other
In the
kinds of regular labor.
United States, the most common form of trafficking is agricultural labor. Um, and so like, okay, this is gonna be a little bit of a rabbit hole because this is really frustrating me.
It touches on everything. This sort of so
Yeah, yeah. But like the whole, um, for me personally, I am very pro open border person.
mhm,
Um, and so like it angers me incredibly to have mass deportations, and mass deportations have happened under both Republican and Democrat presidencies.
mhm,
The current one is not necessarily ahead on deportations, but is doing it in a more cruel and public way, which is intentional and it's
mhm,
awful. It should stop. Um, but the argument that, oh, if you deport all these people, then food prices are going to go up. Yes, because our food prices should go up because we shouldn't be underpaying uh, people working in fields for us. Like it highlights the fact that um, that we're not taking a holistic look at some of the issues going on. The reason why we have cheap food, even if it is US grown, is often because we are underpaying people. And according to the dang, I don't remember who set the definition for slavery. Um, I think it might be the Department of Labor. Uh, Anyone who is being paid uh, less than minimum wage is working slave labor, except for waiters, which
The whole other thing.
that's yeah. But yeah, so we're talking about undocumented people coming in and working for less than minimum wage. That is slave labor, and that is also wrong. Like we need to be upset about the things that are both things that are unjust.
Hmm.
Um, Instead of going, yeah, if you get rid of migrant workers, our prices are going to go up. Um, that's just it's just the wrong argument. Like that is part of the problem. Like you need to understand that there are right arguments and wrong arguments. The wrong argument is you shouldn't be arguing, hey, you can't get rid of our underpaid labor that is technically qualifies as slave labor.
Hmm.
Your argument should be, uh, we need to treat everyone equally with equal dignity and humanity, and so we should be okay with people coming into the United States and be okay with paying them living wages.
Hmm.
That is a hard concept for people to understand. So,
And it shows this sort of the tendency in our society to moralize,
mhm,
moralizing at the individual kind of micro
yeah,
level. The
yeah,
problem is people coming here illegally. Like we say it, put it that way. We don't put the
yeah.
burden on the companies that are exploiting this labor, right?
Oh,
We don't
absolutely.
we don't we don't penalize them really. And really, if we wanted to deal with all of this stuff, like um, eggs being too expensive, shouldn't be to try to figure out how to get eggs cheaper.
Mhm.
We should be figuring out like, well, why is it so bad that people can't afford eggs? Is there a lack of wealth in our society? No. Um, should we redistribute that wealth? Yes, but before we even but after we redistribute it, we should get to the point where you can't have a system where someone is worth $500 billion
Yeah,
while there's homeless people at the same time. It
yeah,
makes no sense. By what right or intrinsic quality is Elon Musk that much more valuable? This is where you get into these other weird myths that somehow it's because he's that great of a genius, which is not even fucking close to true.
no, it's not. The dude makes fake Twitter accounts to interact with himself. Like it's been documented that he does stuff like this. He's not a genius.
He steals good ideas from other people and had wealth
Yeah.
to start with, and he's a
Yeah,
sociopath.
he didn't start most of his companies. I think he actually did possibly start SpaceX, but still, like he didn't start Tesla. He was like PayPal, that wasn't just his idea. I'm not 100% sure if he was there at the beginning or not. But also his wealth came from apartheid South Africa, where he
Well,
had wealth simply because he was white. And his family were exploiting uh black people in South Africa. Like that's where he got his money from. That's where he was able to build up and buy companies and buy input. Like the way that it is set up for a rich person to continue to buy private property, private organizations, private companies, um, and then exploit those workers, which is something that he has done consistently. Like whenever he did buy Twitter and he laid off so many people, like a vast majority of Twitter, uh, and then made people work like 80-hour weeks. That is that is exploitation because he had people that especially people that were here on work visas. A lot of those were the people that stayed who he had to for like he got them to work extra hours because if they quit, they would have to go back to where they would be deported. So like it is calculated exploitation, and we do see this especially in tech right now with the mass amount of layoffs that companies are doing. It's not because they are losing money or they are decreasing business, is because they need to make more money and continue to grow for the stakeholders, for the board members. Like it is all it's exploitation all the way down. So we don't get to a place in society where there is the ultra wealthy without significant systemic levels of oppression against the majority of people. And
Mhm.
that's not even getting into like specific prejudices. um, that's just like the common person does face oppression because of the ultra wealthy.
Yeah, and
I,
it, there's some like there's different scales for addressing these kinds of problems. Like
yeah,
I spent a good chunk of my adult life trying to do the intentional community thing of sharing resources. And I think that's a noble pursuit for people if they want to do that, but it doesn't change the larger thing, right?
yeah,
It becomes really difficult unless you have some rich people in that community to redistribute wealth with, which we did not. That's why I lost my home in a foreclosure. But um, those sorts of like small scale things are good for like rewiring our imaginations away
yeah,
uh, from like ownership to relationship, from
yeah.
stewardship to kinship, like all these sorts of ways of kind of rewiring things. But then, doing the thing like, you mentioned at the outset, a city um, kind of standing up for its people
Hmm.
against some sort of outside claim of like, you need to
Yeah,
obey these laws. Like, we might not think of that as private, like involving private property, but it does. Anytime you have real democracy or something like democracy where people's within a community are being protected over against those who have more power,
hmm.
um, it is challenging the logic of capitalism and private property because that's where
Yeah.
power comes from in our society. Um,
And
yeah.
in like the specific instance of Idaho and Utah, um, yes, there is significant levels of very conservative people that live in both states. On top of that, there are corporations that are also very conservative that put their money into very conservative things. So, the kind of the myth of this could be a fun myth at some point. The myth of individual political um, viewpoints of view,
Mhm.
because there is money being put to groom people to have political ideas, and that it doesn't work as well on everybody as it does on somebody. I'm not saying that it's only conservatives who do this, because it's not. It's also liberals and stuff. um but at the foundation of it, we do have to recognize that a lot of the pushing for things that are seen as conservative or liberal come from a place of corporate greed. And um, if a corporation that is set in a place like Idaho is putting in money to like it, I think the best example of this is the amount of gas companies who put in money into anti-public transportation
Mhm.
initiatives. Um, because public transportation helps a lot more people than getting bigger roads. Uh, but if you have individual use cars, they use gasoline, and gas companies make more money. And so they campaign hugely on essentially creating scare tactics and stuff. That's all to say, like to look at a place like Idaho and say, "Oh, that's just because a lot of conservatives live there." Yes, that's true. However, it's a lot of conservatives that have rich backers feeding them conservative views. the same is going to be true of liberal places, where more liberal-minded companies benefit financially from liberal leaders. Yeah, but
Until
I'm
they
just
don't.
until they don't, and then
So we're
they'll
seeing this
switch.
with all these companies
Yeah,
like
of course.
dropping queer folks like a sack of potatoes,
Yeah.
and it shows the logic. If
Mhm.
it helps the bottom line, they'll do it. It's not coming from a place
Absolutely.
of of relationship or shared humanity at all.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So viva la revolution. We need to I mean, ultimately, we need some kind of revolutionary system to
Yeah.
offset all this. But in the meantime, it's possible, at least within small pockets, to kind of act
Yeah.
under more of the gift economy and sharing and challenging the organizations and institutions that we're connected with to start doing the same.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're
I mean,
screwed.
yeah.
Like,
I
this,
mean, it's not impossible within our kind of current system to make improvements.
yeah.
Um, because something that I've said is like we have a minimum wage, we really should also have a maximum wage.
Mhm.
Like, but like it doesn't have to be like say the highest paid person in a company can't make more than 100 times the lowest paid person. That person's still getting quite rich. However, we have like CEOs of like McDonald's or something that is getting like 2,000 times the amount of the lowest paid person. Um, like 100 times more than the lowest paid person, uh, you're still gonna make a lot of money, but there is like, I can't believe I'm saying this. Like, being paid 100 times more than somebody else makes it more equitable than what it
That's
than the
how
current
bad it
system.
is.
That's how bad it is, and
Yeah.
it really it shouldn't be. Um, but like we could make laws on maximum pays, right?
Mhm.
But we don't because we still currently favor the ultra wealthy.
Or we could go back to the tax rate systems, like the marginal tax rate, like
Yeah,
we had in the 50s. Like, if you made over a certain amount of money, your tax bracket, we've reversed it. The richer
yeah.
you are, the less likely you are to pay taxes. That's dumb.
Back back when I was hyper conservative, so this this is gonna show you where I was at one point in time. Um, I think it was whenever McCain was the Republican,
Mhm.
um, or was it Romney? Whichever one was first.
McCain Palin was before, well,
Was was it?
yeah, Romney ran, I think they ran in the same election, but it's hard to keep track.
Well, they both ran against Obama. I don't remember which one ran first.
Mhm.
Uh, they the person I was pulling for because I was a good Republican at the time
Mhm.
was Mike Huckabee.
Oh, God.
But yeah, but let me say this about him. He proposed a flat percentage for everybody on taxes regardless of what they made, which is a more equitable
Yeah,
all
the
that is to
flat
say that's
tax
a
is
more
much
equitable solution
better.
than what we have
Yeah.
now. Because right now we have higher tax rates for people with lower income than the ultra wealthy, and that's a problem. Like, what are you doing with all this money? I cannot imagine having that much money. I mean, besides build paying to buy rockets and send people
Katy
into
Perry in
space,
space.
or um not sending Katy Perry into space and
Mhm.
pretending like it happened.
It
I
did.
don't
Yeah,
know.
fair enough. And then kissing the ground when she came
Yeah.
back.
Yeah,
Next episode we should do is the myth of Katy Perry.
yeah. God, no. Oh, I have
So,
so many thoughts on Katy Perry. Some of
yeah.
them are positive, some of them are negative. Um, I mean, but good for her for divorcing Russell Brand. Um,
Yeah, she got out of it before things got really bad. He's he's his worst version right
yeah, I was talking to people like months ago, seeing Russell Brand do his like super I'm born again Christian, and we're like, yeah, he's about to be charged with sexual crimes.
Yeah.
And he was, because that is the current way of today is, um, you become Christian, whenever there are allegations against you. Um, like, even Marilyn Manson showed up to Yee's church, whenever he had, um, allegations against him. Like, that's it's a grift whenever that's what's happening.
Hmm. Well, that seems like a good stopping point.
Against that.
Figure
Like, I feel
figure
like
an editing point in there
yeah,
somewhere. End point.
we started on positive news, we're ending on incredibly
Russell
negative
Brand
news.
and yeah.
Yeah. Let's end with some positive news. A town in Georgia, unless it's the Illinois Decatur, because there's a Decatur, Illinois, and a Decatur, Georgia, but I
Mm,
think it's the one in Georgia, is starting a reparations project and looking into the way that the city facilitated slavery and interviewing families and trying to work for reparations for Black families from their involvement in slavery, which I think is pretty cool. And
yeah.
very against Georgia because, like I said, I'm pretty sure it's the Georgia Decatur, not the. It would make sense. Like, I'm in Georgia, and most of the stuff that shows up on my social media feeds are like tailored to my location. So unless it's an algorithm mistake, it's the Georgia Decatur.
Mhm.
Uh, but still, even if it's the Illinois one, that's still really
Yeah.
there's places doing positive things, and it is also important to know that um, some of these things that are actually helping are at the local level, and so yeah, just a
There's a
I
lot of
guess a little
great stuff
reminder.
happening locally, and,
Yeah,
you know, it's possible to build from the local up. That's what the current authoritarian regime did.
yeah,
Uh,
it is.
so that means it's possible for people who want goodness and justice. It's
Yeah,
just gonna take a little bit of time, and people are already doing the work, and more people should join in, and we gotta
yeah.
keep with it. Um,
I will say the work is hard, but it is a little bit easier as the current fascistness of our nation is kind of showing its head, and people are realizing the effects of it. So it does make it a little bit easier, and hopefully we can use that little bit extra push and momentum to make some actual lasting systemic changes.
yeah. Well, uh, any closing, zingers before we log off?
Uh, Zingers, dang.
I got a joke for you.
Okay, we'll do a joke.
People won't get it because it's insider. Like, um, do you know why uh, far leftists um, only drink herbal tea?
No, why do far leftists only drink herbal tea?
Because proper tea is theft. A little bit of Proudhon
That
quote
is
for you. And
that
yeah.
is yeah.
See y'all next time.